to talk about the FINRA 2022 exam report and its focus on regulation best interest. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. We are recording today's conversation and will share it with you following today's session. We welcome your engagement throughout today's conversation. Please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to let us know if you have any questions, concerns, and we have allotted plenty of time at the end of today's session to address your questions. Finally, as with many of you, we are working from our home offices, so you may hear some background noise from time to time. We appreciate your understanding. To get us started, I'm going to ask our esteemed panelists to introduce themselves. Mr. Porteous, may I begin with you?
Thank you very much, Parham. My name is David Porteous. I'm a partner at Faegre Drinker in Chicago in securities enforcement and investment management.
Thank you. Mr. Wagner?
I am Ed Wegener, and I am Managing Director and Practice Lead for Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Oyster Consulting. Before I joined Oyster, I was with FINRA for several years, most recently as the Midwest Regional Director responsible for their risk monitoring and exam program for the Midwest.
Excellent. And Tom?
Thanks, Parham. My name is Tom Selman. I am founder of Scopus Financial Group. We provide regulatory and compliance consulting for broker-dealers, investment advisors, and trade associations. Before founding Scopus in 2020, I served at FINRA in various capacities, most recently as Executive Vice President for Regulatory Policy and Legal Compliance Officer.
Thank you, Mr. Selman. And my name is Parham Nasseri. I'm the Vice President of Regulatory Strategy here at InvestorCOM. I'll play the moderator in today's conversation. And InvestorCOM, just if you haven't heard of us, we are a leading software provider for the wealth managers across North America. Our award-winning platform is known for its intuitive design and has helped firms mitigate compliance risk since 1992. Okay. We have asked you a few poll questions prior to today's session. Let me sort of give you a preamble before this. Over the Reg BI journey, we've been bringing the wealth and compliance community together to better understand how you and your peers are tackling the particulars of the regulations. Prior to today's webinar, we conducted a poll and observed how your responses actually changed through this Reg BI journey. Okay. We first asked if your firm has implemented a strategy to comply with Reg BI's care obligation, a key point throughout the FINRA examination report. And the comparative results are quite remarkable. As you see, there's been a vast increase in the number of firms and folks on the call today who are now tackling the care obligation specifically. Drilling down a little bit into sort of the digitization of record keeping and its elevated importance as Reg BI has matured. And then we asked, given the FINRA's report and emphasis on the product review process, we asked what process do you have currently in place with respect to managing your product shelf? And as you can see, the greatest majority are tackling this process fairly manually. And then finally, we asked about the process for making best interest product and rollover recommendations. And by and large, similar to the prior poll result, you can see that folks appear to have indicated that they are tackling this manually. We'd like to thank you for participating in this poll. We hope you find insight in them and seeing how you and your peers are tackling the specifics of the Reg BI requirements. Now let's move forward to our agenda, where we will be talking about the broad overview of FINRA's 2022 report, then dive into the particulars of the reports specific to making best interest recommendations and having a product review process. And lastly, we'll touch on the best practices around documentation, record keeping, and supervision. And as always, we've allotted time at the end of today's session to take up any questions you may have. So there has been a lot of fodder in the industry and headlines around Reg BI and whether firms are complying or not. And fast forward up to the recent FINRA report. Mr. Selman, if I could start here with you as the former Executive Vice President of Regulatory Policy, I'm sure you've seen these reports in the past and their various purposes. Maybe I can ask you to give our audience here a broad overview of the intended goal here.
Sure, thanks, Param. Well, even when I was at FINRA and I would receive drafts of these reports, and FINRA, as you know, used to prepare both exam findings and separately priorities letter, my first response to the staff preparing the report was, well, it looks like you've covered literally every rule in the rule book. I'm not sure how helpful that's going to be. This form of report now replaces both the exam findings and the priorities letter. But I think there's a similar difficulty perhaps in reading something so comprehensive and understanding what to focus on. Here are 3 tips that I always tell my clients and how to look at these reports. First of all, I think it's important to look at what was repeated from last year and what's new from last year. And FINRA's done a very good job in this report in indicating what is new by bolding the new material. So it doesn't mean you skip over this stuff from last year, but I think it helps you understand a little bit what they've added. And obviously what they've added is of keen interest right now to the examination program. The second thing to look for is what is repeated throughout the report. Reg BI is a good example. Reg BI has its own section in the report, which makes a lot of sense. But then Reg BI is referred to elsewhere. It's referred to the section on SPACs. It's referred to the section on communications with the public, especially concerning mobile apps. It's referred to in the section on private placements. It's referred to in the section on conservation donation transactions. And it's referred to in the section on variable annuities. So, it's not surprising that Reg BI would be a high priority, but I think it's just one example of a topic that's repeated throughout the report. And the repetition of a topic throughout the report indicates that FINRA cares a lot about that topic. And then the third thing to look for is just a change in tone. I think this is the second year in which when I read, for example, the exam findings concerning Form CRS, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but there seems to be a tone of exasperation. Why would you think that CRS is only for situations in which a broker-dealer makes a recommendation? Why would you fail to meet the page limit? Why can't you file these things? The change in tone also indicates, I think, what the staff may be focusing on in their exams is kind of a minimal expectation for compliance. Now, that's a very subjective tip, the tone of the discussion, but it's something I also would look for in these types of reports.
Thanks, Tom. Maybe Ed, you're also, as you mentioned off the top, a former FINRA exec. Would you mind touching on the particulars of the report and anything that stood out to you?
Yeah, I think I took away a lot of the same things that Tom did. I don't think that there's many surprises this year in terms of the content of the report. I do like the format, even though it is long and continues to be long and difficult to get through. The format that they have where they identify, here are key considerations, here are some common findings that we've had on examinations, and then here are some effective practices that you can use. I think the way they lay that out is particularly helpful. But like Tom mentions, it highlights a number of areas that continue to be in the crosshairs year after year. And I think, just like Tom said, you can't gloss over that because it's been in the on the report year after year. That means it's something that's important to them. It continues to be an area where they have findings. And so you'll see areas like cybersecurity and outside business activities and variable annuities, and those things come up year after year. So I'd pay particular attention to those. And then the new areas they highlight are typically around things that are new rules or more recent areas of concern, new rules like Reg BI and areas of recent concern, like the ones that Tom mentioned, but also, one that I found that was interesting is the discussion around record keeping of direct way and application way business. So I do think they have a particular focus on the way firms are maintaining documentation and records, likely because of challenges that they have when they come out to do exams. They're much more data-driven, do analytics before they come out to do an exam. So they're going to want to be able to get records in a way that's usable for them so that they can run those analytics before they come out. And when they have issues like they do with, like they've said they have with direct way business, it causes some frustration, from the examination standpoint. With respect to Reg BI, again, I'm not surprised that it's an area of focus, both because it's relatively new, but also just because of the sheer impact. And like Tom said, I think you can see a level of frustration with some of the areas like disclosures and the timing of disclosures and the application of when the rule or when the requirements apply. What I think it's important to consider is how FINRA uses the report. And, I think it's really kind of two main ways. One is to signal to the industry that these are the areas that they care about. So even if they're not doing an examination, they want firms to know, hey, these are areas that we've seen issues. These are areas where you have concern. We really want you to go and look at your policies, procedures, and controls and make sure that you have them up to speed and up to date. And then making sure that you're covering those things where they're finding potential issues. But it's also used to help the exam and risk monitoring programs define and make decisions around what areas they're going to be focusing on when they come and do an exam. And over the years, the exam program's gotten more risk-based. So when they do an exam, each exam is going to be different based on the unique risks of a particular firm. But I'm confident that if you're engaged in an area of business that's highlighted in the report, and you have an examination that comes up, you can expect that those areas will be covered on the examination. So even more impetus to take the report and use it to assess your programs, both, to address the concerns that they have, but also to be prepared for exams when they happen.
Wonderful. Thanks for sharing that, Ed. David, given your area of focus and practice, looking at the report from a 10,000-foot level, there's a predominant focus on the care obligation. What do you make of this?
I see in the report, particularly its progression, right? We're going to be year 3 by June, but the progression from the fundamentals of not just Reg BI, but the companion components that were adopted at the same time in terms of CRS, but the compliance obligation and the expectations of the WSPs, the directive to review eligible products and looking at your training and the implementation of Reg BI. Those are the fundamental prerequisites. And the care obligation is the building on it. It's where the rubber meets the road in terms of how firms have improved upon their suitability analysis to consider costs, reasonably available alternatives, and the documentation of the recommendations as appropriate with more complex products and circumstances. At the end of the day, our recommendations, quality recommendations, and since it's fundamental to the progression from the suitability rule, the reminder to firms and the focus upon the quality of firms' attention to the care obligation and the recommendation processes is fundamental to the system as a whole. But it's a sum of its component parts. Like I think Tom or Ed, you were saying that the exasperation with, boy, if you can't even get CRS right, whether and to what extent your WSPs have adequately drawn attention to the best interest process that the firm has, the differentiation from what the expectation was before from the suitability standard to now the best interest standard. It is the DNA of the new rule is really the care obligation and how it finds itself insinuated into the various aspects of your operations and systems of supervision and practices down to the retail recommendation level. So the duty of care follows along with that, but it's part and parcel of the other components that came along with the rule. So I think that's how we see the exam findings laying out. What are we seeing in terms of the quality of policies and procedures? What are we seeing in terms of just publication of CRS or best interest information. I think one of the things I saw was that they observed that firms made it difficult to find the CRS. You had to click through in order to get that information. You know, that's looking at the PKN details and important ones in terms of how people get information, but the care obligation is the fundamental driver in terms of the recommendation process.
Yeah, I'd like to add that I mean, you guys may have a different opinion, but I think of the different elements of Reg BI and Form CRS, the conflicts management, the disclosure, Form CRS, and the care obligation. The failure to supervise charge, I think, is most likely going to be with the care obligation. The others probably would be just firm, direct violations, but you could have individuals charged with failure to supervise, a branch in its recommendations under the care obligation.
Wonderful remarks. Thank you for sharing that. Ed, maybe let's start with some of the specifics or more of the specifics around the exam findings. Do you find it interesting that FINRA again re-highlighted the definition of the retail investor? What do you why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think it's interesting, but I'm not surprised by it. The definition of retail investor under Reg BI is more expansive than I think some firms had applied it in different contexts before, and I think that's led to some confusion. And so we've seen exams of clients where FINRA, the SEC, took issue with how they were applying Reg BI and the Form CRS requirement to certain types of clients, like high net worth individuals or accredited investors, when firms are engaged in things like private placements and things where, under the suitability requirement, I think there was, confusion as to whether, that applied there. But it definitely does apply if you're dealing with retail investors, which would include high net worth and accredited investors. And so I think it's important that firms make sure that they understand the definition of retail investor, make sure that it's clear in their policies and procedures when Reg BI and Form CRS apply based on that definition. But also extremely importantly is that, that you're training your registered reps and your supervisors on that definition so that there's no confusion. We've seen a lot of our clients that have taken a more conservative approach just to kind of stay away from any of the gray areas. So if there's any confusion with respect to, whether a particular client meets the definition, they're erring on the side of caution and applying Reg BI and providing the Form CRS disclosures.
Thanks for sharing that, Ed. Now, sort of looking at the specifics outlined around the deficiencies of the examinations, Tom, maybe I can ask you to drill down on FINRA's report as it touches on establishing a product review process for identifying and categorizing risks and the complexity of their respective products. What do you make of this specifically?
Well, I've always found that the consideration of the reasonably available alternatives is the biggest issue for firms in the product. I mean, obviously, for any product on the platform, a firm has to do its due diligence, has to understand the product. That's especially true for alternative products, but it's true of all products. And the financial advisor has to understand the product as well. But the question of reasonably available alternatives is a new feature in the regulation. It applies on the investment advisor side too, by the way, and I think in the fiduciary standard. So it's the question is what does that actually mean, and how is it actually imposed? One thing I thought that was interesting in the report is that much of the, and maybe all the times that it mentioned reasonably available alternatives was under the rubric of conflicts of interest. So it seemed as if the staff, maybe that was inadvertent, but was considering reasonably available alternatives as part of the question of mitigating conflicts of interest. So if you have a conflict with product A, but there's an alternative where you don't have the conflict, maybe you should offer the alternative. But I would imagine the staff will also consider it more broadly. So to me, that's the most important question. And I'm not sure exactly what the definition of reasonably available is.
Yeah, it is quite a broad term. David, maybe I can ask you this from a overall sort of practice management perspective. Any tips or tricks around sort of how to reasonably assess alternatives?
You know, I think following what Tom was just talking about in terms of the product review process, so much of the recommendation process, it really begins with the firm making a product shelf cleaner or better categorized, so that when the representative is sitting down to meet with the customer, they work through the progression of what are we trying to do, what are your objectives here, and I think a lot of times we also assume in the context of a recommendation that you're always dealing with a prospect, as compared to a 5-year relationship for which there's a good bit of historical knowledge regarding what the customer's objectives are and what we did for them last year. And so we're revisiting XYZ. But put all that to one side, I think moving your way through the categories and the firms having categorized, okay, we have this shelf of products for persons in kind of retirement mode. We have this shelf of products for people in a growth mode. And there could be similar asset classes in multiple categories. And I think by availing your representatives of a system of understanding, okay, as you're working your way through and understanding what the client's objectives and goals are. And again, we could be dealing with a historical relationship for which you have a lot to build off of and understanding what the risks and goals are. And we're dealing with a rollover of a product to the same asset class as we previously recommended to them. Well, as you work your way to, okay, how am I documenting this? The volume and the quantity or the quality of that documentation is going to vary, not only in connection with the risk of the products or its complexity of the recommendation. I think as the report, the final report with the adopting release said, look, a less complex, for example, like a mutual fund transaction or a rollover may not require much of anything in the way of documentation, as compared to, Tom, as you were alluding to, alternatives or other categories of products that could be deemed to be more complex. So I think it's having that sense of and making and empowering the representatives with enough information that as they sit and work their way through a recommendation and they're thinking through what the firm has made available to me on the product shelf, then when I get to the point of having to evaluate what alternatives to that may be, we've already worked through some progression, right? Either on a historical basis, all we're dealing with in this particular context is a recommendation of a similar asset class as what I had previously recommended to them because that's what they're interested in, versus are we opening up, the kimono? What am I seeking to do with this bucket of assets? So I think it's a lot of old hat to the good representatives that have been doing this job for a long time in terms of saying, you're telling me or you're regulating how I otherwise do my business. What is new and different about this is really just making sure that you're documenting the way that you go through your progression in some way, shape, or form that not only you can understand it and your supervisor can understand it. And then ultimately, if God forbid the firm is asked to provide information on a particular recommendation to an examination or an investigation, they can explain it in hindsight.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Let me go back to some of the insights that we garnered through the poll, and specifically when it came to this concept of setting up a product review process. Majority of responses indicated that they do have a process, but it's being undertaken manually. What do you make of that? Maybe I'll sort of ask you first, Ed. Is that even a possibility? Thinking about how many different product types, how many different products are actually available on that product shelf?
It's interesting because the rule's agnostic as to whether things are done manually, whether they're, supported by technology. But we've talked about this when we were preparing. It seems like the regulators are getting to the point where they're assuming that there's going to be some sort of technology support around the compliance with the rules, because the way the rules are written is they're becoming more and more complex. more difficult to document. And their expectation is that you have some way of monitoring compliance on a regular basis. And, you can do that on a manual basis, but it becomes difficult to do. And I think this is especially important now because of what both Tom and David had said, is that, FINRA and the SEC have made it clear that they're broadening the reviews and they're reviewing more than just disclosures and conflict mitigation, but really taking deeper dives into the care obligation, how the care obligation differs from the suitability assessments that were done before. And they say what they've seen so far is that they're seeing a lot of the same types of things, just calling it something different. So they expect it to be different. And I think that's a little bit tough in terms of what those expectations are. But one thing is that there's this reasonably available alternative assessment that's done. And so while you can do it in a manual process, some of the challenges are, what you want to make sure is that you're providing the reps in the field the information that they need in order to be able to do those assessments, right? And that's very challenging to do on a manual basis, making sure that they have access to the right information to assess cost and performance and risk for those alternatives. So that can be challenging to push out that information on a manual basis. You also, one of the things that I've heard from clients is it's difficult to sort of force high quality, consistent reviews across the board. So when you have a manual process, and let's say you have a form that somebody's filling out, you're going to get different quality of the responses there. And what I've heard from compliance people is they'll get the reviews back, they'll look at them and it's a very short, yeah, I looked at some other products and this one's the best. Or, some are really fulsome and stuff, but it's really hard to sort of force that process when you're doing it manually. You can drive a process better when you're using some sort of technology. The documentation, and like David said, you don't have to document in all cases. I think the SEC expects that you are documenting in those cases that he mentioned, especially with more complex products, but you do have to demonstrate that you're compliant with the rule. So even though you don't have to document the rationale, you have to have some way to show that you've done it. That's something that's harder when you have a manual process. And then there's this concept that they have in there about monitoring for compliance, to monitor to make sure people are doing these assessments. And to be able to do that when you have a manual process and people are filling out a form and sticking it in a file or making comments in a CRM, that becomes much more challenging if you don't have some technology support to do that monitoring. So yes, I think it's you can comply in a manual basis. It's just it becomes much more challenging. And I think the way technologies and tools have developed, regulators' expectations are increasing in terms of what they expect from firms in terms of their compliance and monitoring. So I think that it will continue to be a challenge to do so on a manual basis.
So we've talked a lot about reasonably available alternatives, product recommendations, as well as this sort of a product review process. When it comes to RIA specifically, FINRA went as far as prescribing a solution by which basically firms can provide a resource. Firms will need to provide resources to financial professionals when making recommendations that account for reasonably available alternatives with comparable performance, risk, and return. David, what do you make of this specifically, and with respect to employing different tools and whether technology or manual solutions are the way to go?
Yeah, in terms of, to be fair, Parm, I think manual versus automated is somewhat of a false dichotomy. It's really a bit of both, right? There's of course manual components in the recommendation process holistically, but if you take it back to the tools that the firm just provides the representatives in terms of the decision tree, how do we help the representative articulate to the client the differentiation between, in the case of a dual IABD, our advisory services versus our brokerage services, or even if we're only a broker, or And if we're only a broker, how do we help the person understand our services and what, whether and to what extent a brokerage account may be right for them. And following that progression, then having, like we talked about a minute ago, the product list, right? Giving people the access to the information on their shelf and the scope of products that may be available. Is that readily available on the internet site? Is there potential for product bias that a representative might just start selling the same thing if you don't provide them with a pretty comprehensive digest of the products that you have on the shelf that meet different risk objectives and categories? So again, the technological support or tool that provides them with a pretty good catalog of what the different products are for different types of scenarios and situations. And then moving from that to the scenario of, okay, we've talked about a few different types of asset classes for you, and I want to show you what the costs look like for this variable annuity as compared to this UIT over here. And those are two very different assets, but based upon the conversation you're having, I want to make sure you understand this. And then to Ed's point, being able to have real-time documentation as to what it is that I showed them. Maybe I have a fact sheet, maybe I was able to print it off, in particularly where relationships are going more and more online or digital or remote. The technological tool becomes more needful in order for be able to sort of flash on the screen or give them some information or send them some information that says, here's kind of the few different products that we offer that I showed you, and then progression from there saying, well, how does this product and its performance and its costs kind of compare to some other similar ones, maybe the ones that you guys offer? Help me understand the choices for these different time horizons or needs that I have, and being able to get data that supports that analysis to say, yeah, well, let me show you how the costs look like for this compared to this other product. I was talking to a firm the other day, and the same asset had two very different cost structures, which really dealt with two very different types of investors. So even within an asset class and a product, without a real understanding of the nuances of the cost features, you could be recommending something for people who have very different investment objectives and desired outcomes. So just tracking and keeping track of that and being able to convey it in a cogent fashion for an investor to make a good decision for themselves, let alone the basis of the recommendation, you need to have the information at your fingertips. And there's a number of providers out there who have good products that help digest the entire firm's product suite, catalog it all, so that at least as between different asset classes or within an asset class, you can do some cost comparisons, let alone against industry benchmarks and other information, what other people are selling. And having that kind of information makes it, not only from a regulatory standpoint, a defensible recommendation, you're putting your clients in a position to feel that they made the right choice and feel good about the recommendation that they're accepting.
Yeah, if I could give an example, Parm, of just very briefly of a situation I've seen that is on the opposite end of what David and David's talked about and Ed mentioned too on reasonably available alternatives, just comparing products. I know of broker-dealers who sell DSTs, Delaware Statutory Trusts, which are essentially real estate partnerships when people want to exchange real estate they have and get a 1031 exchange benefit in the US. I know broker-dealers who only offer one program. That to me, you've got an alternative investment privately offered, fairly complex real estate with tax deferral that has to be explained, and you're only offering one product. I would think that would easily be a target by an examiner.
Really good point. Ed, were you going to add to what David had suggested as well?
Yeah, well, no, I was just going to say, David, when he was talking, just to sort of emphasize a point that he had made earlier, is that when you're, the documentation that you have shouldn't just talk about the recommendation that you're making at the point in time, the alternatives that you considered over time. It's got to tell a story about the relationship with the customer over time. So whatever documentation you have, should expand beyond just that particular transaction so that you can put it into context.
Makes sense. And I apologize for the lag. I often go back and forth between the mute button and it's sometimes elusive. Let me sort of do a little bit more of a theoretical question before moving forward. And Tom, maybe I can ask you this particular question, and folks between David and Ed, feel free to add to what Tom suggests here. One of the primary points of confusion, as we've talked about, is stemmed from making product recommendations and assessing reasonably available alternatives. Prior to Reg BI, there was this rule, FINRA's Rule 211. How do you believe Reg BI specifically compares to the suitability rule?
Well, it is a best interest standard. I think it's more, I wouldn't say it's more principles based, but it introduces principles that were not specific under the suitability rule, like the treatment of rollovers, the reasonably available alternatives issue, focusing much more on conflicts. I argue that the conflicts requirements, for example, under Reg BI are stricter than those for an investment advisor under a fiduciary standard. So in various ways, I mean, I'd still think the core of the care obligation is essentially a suitability standard, but it goes beyond suitability by considering these other issues. And I think best interest as a standard gives the examiner and the enforcement divisions more flexibility to bring a case.
Well, that's especially true. I mean, if you think about the suitability requirements before under 2111, there was the reasonable basis, customer specific and quantitative elements of those. And to your point, Tom, with respect to giving the regulators more tools, one of the areas they've continued to be frustrated with is quantitative suitability and being able to bring cases around churning for cases where it was difficult to prove de facto control when customers weren't cooperating or you had other issues involved. With the change under Reg BI, for that particular piece of it, quantitative, the quantitative aspect under suitability under 2111, there was the requirement to prove de facto control, which you don't have now under Reg BI. And so I think that's going to provide the regulators with a lot more ability to be able to bring cases there. And so I think you can expect for firms that were engaged in activities that they didn't like under suitability, but couldn't do much about, firms that were, had high turnovers, high cost of equity, a lot of volume in equity trading, you're going to start seeing those cases come out under Reg BI. And I think that's because of that difference that Reg BI has.
If I can add a point to that too, I also, I see some positives in peeling back the control requirement for evaluating a series of related transactions, because I think it also goes to the documentation issue we were discussing in the context of a long-standing relationship. It should not be unexpected that you would have a representative to say, look, this is the 4th or 5th time we're doing this particular type of transaction. And so it may not be the documentation or the rationale provided for a particular recommendation is all that detailed in light of the fact that it's part of a series of related transactions. That there's a sword and a shield component. Yes, if you're churning an account, irrespective of control over it, that's a supervisory issue, let alone something that the firm needs to be making sure people are understanding and making a recommendation to the same asset class or series of portfolio issues that they may be managing. But I think the broader issue is taking stock of the fact and grounding yourself in the fact that, look, there's nothing wrong with the fact that this client likes this product, and I can bake that into the basis of my recommendation, so long as the cost and the other aspects of this don't start looking like a churning scenario, right? What is the turnover ratio or other kinds of aspects? I think what I was trying to get at there is that noting the fact that this is a product the clients decide to roll over from this because it was coming to term and we're rolling into this a similar product with a similar term once again, that's not a bad thing. and it can be highlighted as a basis for a recommendation as well, as much as BI is putting emphasis on the fact that, hey, we're lowering the standard by which we can go after churning cases. The flip side to that is don't overlook the fact that in making recommendations, there's nothing wrong with the fact that your client has an affinity for a particular asset class, or given their risk objectives and profile, that this is an asset that meets their needs. And so there's a reason why I'm making recommendations periodically as it comes to term or whatever it may be.
Now, David, if we were to kind of, there was a few mentions throughout today's conversation around making best interest rollover recommendations, and that particular notion also found itself in the FINRA report as well. If you were to look at the specifics around making best interest rollover recommendations, and going back to some of the conversations, David, you and I have had around the PTE, Prohibited Transaction Exemption 2020-02, which is a mouthful, what would you tell your clients around getting ready for that particular deadline while keeping this particular best interest notion in mind as well?
Yeah, so a couple of things. One is, as my colleague who leads our risk practice, Fred Reich, always tells me, like, the day came and went. It was February 1st. It had a bare minimum. So you know, whether and to what extent you're preparing for the documentation requirements that I believe begin July 1 is a different issue. But to the point you're asking on a higher level, I think that there's an inherent bleed in preparations for PTE 2020-02 and the use of rollover forms for plans to IRAs or IRAs to IRAs that may implicate PTE 2020-02, that the enhancements that firms are making to their rollover forms for those types of transactions are good to think about whether or not it involves one of those types of transactions. So even if it's not involving qualified assets and you're making a recommendation, and I think because BI did focus on rollovers from plans into brokerage or advisory accounts, this is just a necessary step in that process that, you know, DOL PTE 2020-02 has gone effective with the various dates that it has in place. So I see it as adding to the rollover forms that firms may have been or may have put into place with the implementation of BI in 2020, and now with the effective dates of PTE 2020-02, just enhancing the documentation.
Thanks for sharing that, David. Let me take a quick pause and maybe a deep breath here. There is, we're at the 1:45 mark almost. Maybe I can invite our audience members here to submit their questions through the chat box. It would be a great opportunity to sort of pick the brains of our esteemed panelists here while we have them for the remainder of the hour. We have had some preliminary questions come in through the polls, as well as kind of folks submitting questions. So we'll get to that in a quick minute. Let me actually go back and as promised through the agenda, Ed, maybe I can ask you specifically around what FINRA is required around tracking Form CRS disclosure. I'm sure your clients are asking you about this. What are you seeing in place, and what are some good practices for implementing sound surveillance practices?
You know, I mean, it's like any other requirement that they have for, you know, providing disclosures to customers as part of transactions. They're going to want to see, how do you document that you've done it, and how are you monitoring to look for any red flags of non-compliance? And when I was with FINRA, we had issues around prospectus delivery requirements, and, you know, that was a big issue that firms weren't tracking prospectus delivery, and because they weren't tracking it, things kind of got askew, and firms were missing prospectus delivery more times than they knew they were, and then it required, you know, significant remediation to go back and address those issues. So I think you're going to see the same thing here with Reg BI in terms of the CRS disclosure with Reg BI disclosures. Just the general Reg BI requirement, or the Form CRS requirement, to have that posted on your website. I think to Dave's point, one of the things that I see consistently when we assess firms is that it takes several clicks to get to the disclosure on your website. Sometimes it's buried under legal disclosures, which is in a small font at the bottom of your web page, and then you click there, and then there's multiple disclosures before you see the one, and it's not titled in an intuitive way. So even somebody who understands the rules and the requirements, I have a real difficult time finding the Form CRS disclosure. So I think that that's an easy get for the regulator. So it's important that you go and make sure that you have that prominently displayed like the rule requires. But in terms of the providing the disclosure, I think it's just important that you document that it's been provided to the extent that you can get an indication that the customers received it, whether that's through some acknowledgement manually or through a technology that you can track when people receive it. I think that that's a great practice. And then having ways to monitor, to assess whether it's periodically when you're doing branch office reviews or some other way when you're doing it manually, looking for red flags that things aren't being disclosed, aren't being provided, or aren't being provided timely, or through technology, if you have some way to monitor that. That's what they're going to expect to see. And they've already started to see issues. I mean, this is one of the areas that they've already been examining for. They've been finding issues with it. They've been taking enforcement actions. And I expect that you can continue to see them do that. Again, that's where you see the frustration that Tom was talking about as they continue to see these issues with delivery, and which makes them question when they start doing a deeper dive on the care obligation, what they're going to be seeing there.
Thank you, Ed. That's very illuminating. We've got some questions trickling in, but before that, there were some questions around what are some technology vendors who provide some assistance and some support here. We've talked about technology quite a bit. With that said, let me pass it over to my colleague, Travis Champion, who heads up our business development efforts in the United States. Travis?
Yeah, thanks, Parm, and thanks, Tom, Ed, and David. It's always nice to hear from the experts. And one thing is I touch on a couple of these items here. We did cover a lot of this on this slide, and I think first off, and most importantly, something that we're hearing on a weekly basis, multiple times a week, firms' message is changing, and it's backing up prior to that product comparison. It's backing into that. How do we do a better job at creating, managing that shelf? And so, the product shelf management, it's becoming a larger piece of part of the conversation. The ability, as David mentioned, that's becoming critical. As Ed talked about, the manual, the ability to do this manually or some combination of automated versus manual. One of the other benefits to the InvestorCOM solution is clearly the ability for this drop-in approach, which will give you that product shelf management, that recommendation piece, as well as kind of that native documentation and disclosure. So it's wonderful to hear that there are vendors and solution providers out there providing this, particularly from InvestorCOM being able to address the very, very relevant items that are discussed today and that our clients and our prospects are discussing, is exactly kind of what we're doing and what we're bringing to the market. So that's exciting. We're very busy, and we would encourage any of you who have questions and challenges to solve and opportunities within the shelf, within your product comparison, and also your documentation and disclosure, including delivery. Please do reach out and for a live demo. We'd be happy to sit with you and your teams and discuss some solutions.
Thank you, Travis. All right, we've got sort of a bit over 10 minutes left. Let's jump into the Q&As. I'll start out with some of the easier ones, at least the ones that are fresh on my mind. Can any of the panelists please remind our audience about the specific documentation requirements that are required post in the summer of I think, David, this alludes to your point about July with respect to PTE 2020-02.
Yeah, so this relates to the non-enforcement policy that DOL has extended to June 30th of 2022. So meaning effective July 1, the specific documentation and disclosure requirements for rollover recommendations will need to be provided effective that date. The point I was making is that prior to that date, you still have an obligation to comply with the duty of care in making the recommendation to people in compliant with the PTE requirements. It's just that the specific documentation and disclosure requirements haven't kicked in. So that doesn't mean that you shouldn't still be at least internally tracking the bases for the rollover recommendation and the compliance with the other aspects of what PT 2020-02 expects. So.
And so let me ask this, actually, I'll pass it to anybody else who wants to remark on this before I ask my question. Hearing none. If a firm is looking to comply with either of the sets of the regulations, is it sort of best practice to sort of assume documentation of rollovers is absolute necessity as a starting point?
I would say that documentation under Reg BI is a little bit more squishy than it is under the PTE. You don't have to, under Reg BI, document the basis for recommendations in general, but as Dave said earlier, that, depending on the circumstances, I think there is an expectation of documentation. You do have to be able to demonstrate compliance with the rules, so they're going to be looking for some sort of documentation in terms of that. With the PTE, there's a specific requirement that you document the rationale for the rollover, why it's in the best interest of the retirement investor, and that you deliver that to the customer.
Good point. Thanks for sharing that, Ed. Let me ask you this. Do you expect any of the modernization of e-delivery and consent requirements changing in the near future as it pertains to Form CRS and other disclosure deliveries?
Yeah, I had seen that there was I think a comment letter from SIFMA around the time frame of the implementation date for Reg BI, saying that the SEC's guidance, I think from the mid-90s, regarding obtaining affirmative consent in order to conduct electronic delivery of communications, whatever it may be, was outmoded for a variety of reasons related to how firms traditionally are communicating with clients, that it should be the default where paper delivery is required, so that you don't have to get affirmative consent, but people can opt out of electronic delivery and instead take paper. I haven't seen further comment on that since I think SIFMA's suggestion on that, but what I can say is, particularly with the proliferation of the quality of web interfaces for advisors and brokers providing online solutions to their clients, whether it's just accessing their account or it's receiving robo advice, it becomes all the much more important to emphasize that this platform is users who are willing to take and receive electronic delivery, not the least of which is delivering the Form CRS, the kind of challenges firms went through having to do thousands upon thousands of paper mailings as compared to being able to get consent now with an existing client to say, okay, well, we'll send you the updates electronically. So I think it's headed that direction, but I need to see, given the variety of issues that the SEC has on their plate, whether that sort of gets addressed in some updated books and records requirement or gets sidelined a little longer.
Good points all around. Thank you. So let me ask you this. There's been a couple of questions around this, and I think it's somewhat of a generic question, as Travis mentioned, that we get in our journeys with various prospects and our clients. What do you believe is an absolute necessity when it comes to assessing reasonably available alternatives? Is it an assessment of product versus product, or sort of overall financial plan? For example, is it I'm kind of combining some of the questions that have come through the chat box here. Would it be comparing a particular ETF to an ETF, or an ETF all the way, a bond fund ETF all the way down to a variable annuity? Any thoughts or insights on that point?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the assumption has been that it's just product to product in the same category of product. So it'd be, bond ETF to bond ETF, not bond. I'm not even sure it would be bond ETF to bond mutual fund. The big concern, though, is that they begin to think outside those products. And there's some language in the report and in other things I've seen out of the commission staff that kind of imply maybe they're thinking, I was talking about the FINRA report, but other things that the SEC staff said that makes me wonder whether they may be thinking beyond the specific product. But I think the industry should frankly insist that it's product to product, that you don't have to compare some unrelated different category.
Isn't the presumption that that assessment has been done as part of deciding what you want to recommend, that you've come to the conclusion already as part of your regular review of the customer, their profile, and in making the recommendation that the type of product that's available, then once you've decided that you would assess alternatives within that product class. But yeah, I mean, if it goes beyond that, I think that's going to be even more challenging.
And this comes out, I think you could argue this comes out of the DOL rule, which had that comparison among mutual funds, for example. And I remember DOL staff insisting that they weren't talking about comparing outside of that category. So if the SEC said that you do, then they're taking a more aggressive position than even DOL did.
Thank you for sharing your insights there. For some reason, my camera has gone off, but I believe me, I'm still here. There is a yeah, here it is. There is a particular question around insights around the Form CRS violations. There's been multiple sort of headlines around this. Any insights around what you believe are the key points of, I guess, concern here?
Yeah, if I can speak to it, I think Ed used the term exasperation is kind of the fundamental piece. And I think one of the elements or a couple of the threads in the comments from FINRA's exam report, but I think if you also just read some of the press releases that accompany these cases being announced, is there's some instances in which firms didn't effectuate or didn't conform to the specific language of CRS. It's got very prescribed mandated disclosures, and deviations from that are not permitted. So if you're supposed to be describing the C, stands for conflict relationship summary, and at some level, and to the extent that you're describing conflicts and then saying, but these aren't really that much of a conflict, or trying to downplay something, that's not within really the anticipated scope of CRS. So they really want you to stick to the script, and they understand in adopting it that you got a lot more to say, and so that's fine. Put it in your BI disclosure document, put it on the website, provide hyperlinks to more information where people can find more detail on these issues, but the deviation from the scripted language just isn't permitted. I've had exchanges with the exam staff where they're saying, hey, here's what the rule says, and the language you have here just isn't permitted, full stop. So I think that's, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to agree with you. And we've seen examinations, they've been very focused and going through those disclosures, both the Reg BI disclosures and the Form CRS, with a fine tooth comb. And they're very critical about what's in there. And Form CRS has been very much around sticking to what the language that the rule requires. So absolutely.
Folks, we're just about to hit the hour mark, or 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where I reside. A wholehearted thank you to Tom, Ed, and David, as well as our audience, for participating in today's webinar. We look to continue to stay engaged in this community, and look forward for more webinars and content coming your way from our side of the show. Thank you all, and have a great afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.